Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications so you guys don't miss a single video. And now... Hello again, dudes and dudettes, and welcome back to ImTheDude Games. Before you guys start to think otherwise, the background gameplay is not a demonstration or a live stream or recording of me playing Fall Guys. It's just background gameplay to have something on the screen while I go on my in-depth review on my thoughts and opinions on the Final Fantasy VII Remake video game, as opposed to other reviews of movies and games that I've done in the past. I'm not going to give a complete breakdown of the entire plot of the game. More so, I'm going to go into just my thoughts and opinions on the overall plot, some things that I've learned by watching some different videos that kind of explain some of the questions that I had about certain elements of the game itself. And there's just going to be some Fall Guys background gameplay. It was easier for me to just record background gameplay of a different game rather than go back into Final Fantasy VII and just to record some gameplay of me running around and fighting stuff since I'd already beaten the game. And so, first I'm going to reiterate, this is Square Enix's remake, or rather reimagining, of their original Final Fantasy VII video game, and this is only the first installment of their remake. So there's going to be, it's confirmed that there is going to be a part 2, and we'll see somewhere down the road about a part 3 or subsequent parts after that. First off, I just want to start by saying that this being my first playthrough of Final Fantasy VII, technically, because I never played the original game for the PlayStation 1. I was absolutely blown away. I enjoyed the game from start to finish, wholeheartedly. There were definitely some elements of the game that I had some questions about, and I was kind of formulating my own theories throughout the entirety of my Let's Play. Mainly about the specters, or the whispers / arbiters of fate, if you will, the watchers of fate. Those black spirit dementor looking things that kind of permeate the plot of the game throughout minor plot points to some very large plot points throughout the entire game. The core plot of the game and most of the things that happen within the game stick pretty true to the original. Avalanche is fighting against Shinra to stop their consumption of the planet's energy known as Mako, because it's in turn killing the planet in them doing that, using that energy the way that they do. And Avalanche is a supposed or so-called eco-terrorist group. Obviously, they're labeled that by Shinra because Shinra is a quasi-governmental evil corporation that likes to have its fingers in all the pies, so to speak. So, the plot and the characters of the game alone are very interesting. I mean, each plot of each Final Fantasy game and story and setting are different from the last, and each of the characters are different from the last. So this being technically the second Final Fantasy game that I've played all the way through and beaten. The first being Final Fantasy 15. I have played Crisis Core Final Fantasy 7, the prologue to Final Fantasy 7, but I never beat it. So this being the second Final Fantasy game that I've played all the way through and beaten, I kind of get a feel for the aesthetic and the kind of like fantasy plot and worlds that these games kind of create. So first off, I really want to dive into some of the story elements, because from what I've seen of videos of the original Final Fantasy VII and from past storytelling elements of past Final Fantasy games, really, Square Enix and the developers there, the story writers, they've very vividly brought this entire world and this entire city of Midgar back to life in really the most stunning way that only Square Enix can. I can't imagine it looking any better than it did. The aesthetic of it is very quasi-futuristic, very diesel punk. It's a different aesthetic to other Final Fantasy games, but it's just the sprawling cityscape alone. Like, I would have liked more free roam around the city, but Final Fantasy VII being the kind of very self-contained game and self-contained story that it is, I can understand why they didn't add a whole lot of free roam. Really, the most free roam you get is in Chapter 14, when you're completing the last side quests for people in the Sector 5 slums and in Wall Market. That's really as much free roam as you get, and even then you're kind of limited to certain areas. So understandably, this game really doesn't have a lot of free roam because it's trying to stick to its own very self-contained story and plot. It's trying to push the player to go through the story. Understandably, this isn't one of those types of games that can allow for much free roam. Aside from not having much free roam, the gameplay and the combat in this game is superb. And I mean superb. Having Final Fantasy 15 to compare to this game, being the last Final Fantasy game that came out before this, and being the last Final Fantasy game that I played before 7, the gameplay and combat of this game was phenomenal. They did definitely change a few things, whereas you had to use ATB meter in order to use items or spells or any kind of ability. But you had full control of every character in your party between Tifa, Cloud, Barret, and Aerith. The only one you didn't have control over was Red 13 because he was more of a companion that kind of helped and assist in damage toward the very end of the game. So this only being the first installment, I am a little disappointed that we didn't get to see more of Red 13, but obviously we'll get to see more of him in the future installments of Final Fantasy VII Remake. I really don't have much to say on much of the gameplay elements aside from I love it. I absolutely love it. The combat all usually felt very fluid. Each character has their own RPG kind of based role. You know, Cloud's the warrior, the sword fighter. Tifa's the hand-to-hand combat brawler, or the monk, if you will. Barret and Aerith are more ranged attackers, while Barret's also more of a tank. He can absorb and redirect damage from the rest of the party to him to kind of help keep everybody else alive, and also just tank damage and dish out just as much. Aerith is the very, very powerful mage and also a ranged attacker, and so she's heavily magic based. So she definitely has her uses in various combat scenarios. And so as far as like a core group of RPG based roles for these characters, reimagined from standard like turn-based style combat to kind of running around in a 3D environment and controlling one character at a time, but being able to fully control all the characters whenever you want in combat at your discretion is fantastic, because it doesn't just limit you to playing as one character. You get to experience all the characters at once. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. It was definitely an improvement over Final Fantasy 15, where the only character you could really fully control was Noctis. And once you had ATB meter or special meter built with the other members of your party, you got to use their special abilities, whatever ability you had equipped to them at the time. It wasn't really until all the DLC content of 15 that you did get the chance to play Ignis, Prompto, and Gladiolus in their own self-contained DLC storylines. So I still have to play those for myself. A long time ago when I did that series, I said I was going to cover the DLC content, but I haven't gotten the chance yet. But, I mean, never say never. I'll still probably get the chance sooner or later once I decide to do that. But anyway, I'm trying not to get too off topic, so covered pretty much most of the gameplay and combat elements that I could think of. There were some mini games, obviously, where it's not necessarily a quick time event, but there are button prompts. The entire scene in the Honeybee Inn, where Cloud is dancing on stage with Andrea Rodea and all that stuff, that being a highly stylized cinematic button prompt fest. I already expressed my opinions during my Let's Play that I didn't really care for that. It looked very flashy, and it was entertaining to a point. It had entertainment value, but I already, heavily expressed my opinions on button prompts and QuickTime events in video games, that I very much dislike them, and that I felt like if they were going to do something like that in the game, that they maybe could have just limited it to... They maybe could have done something better to give the player more interaction with that scene, as opposed to just having, a button prompt QuickTime event. If they wanted to include the player in that whole scene scenario, then they could have done a little bit better. They could have done something else to include the player in that, or they could have just left it as a cutscene. To be perfectly honest, that's how I genuinely feel about that. Otherwise, the gameplay and the combat was very consistent, very challenging, interesting to get used to in certain combat scenarios, depending on what enemies I went up against, especially bosses. I'm thoroughly impressed and thoroughly enjoyed the gameplay elements and the combat elements of the game. There were definitely some comedic storytelling dialogue in certain parts of the game. I mean, that first trip to Wall Market is a hoot and a half. It made me laugh at several points. I was thoroughly entertained by Chapter 9's content. The different enemies of the game, not just the bosses, but the different enemies, this being my first playthrough of this game, really kept me guessing. I mean, this was a blind playthrough that I did, and all the different enemy types, once I came up against a different enemy type that I wasn't used to fighting, they really did give me a challenge, and I really had to try to adapt on the fly. And if I ever got beaten, I had to kind of come back to it after I'd studied up a little bit more on it. And there were times where I probably should have used assess materia a little bit more just to figure stuff out, to better prepare myself. I will say that the way that they design the gear system in this game is vastly different than Final Fantasy 15, because Final Fantasy 15 had... You could basically combine any items with any and all magical energy that you wanted in the game. You could very easily break the combat system of the game by getting some very powerful weapons very early on in Final Fantasy 15, as well as combine some very powerful items with very, very powerful magical energy. And so your magic casting and your weapon damage in Final Fantasy 15 was very, very powerful very early on, and not too many of the enemy encounters or boss encounters in the game felt terribly challenging. Like, it was fun to play through, but none of it felt very challenging, and so it wasn't as, fun and exciting to play through when there wasn't much of a challenge, whereas the gear system in Final Fantasy VII is very different. Obviously, in Final Fantasy 15, you level up and you gain a certain amount of action points to spend on skills. The skill tree for Final Fantasy 15 and all your characters was very different because it was more attributed to like strength, your weapon damage was, how strong your magic casting was, and just overall how Noctis and the rest of the unit's abilities kind of control the flow of battle, essentially. But with Final Fantasy VII, obviously you have a bunch of weapons that can be obtained, a bunch of weapons and armor that can be obtained through various points in the game. Each character has, I think, 5 base weapons and then like 1 or 2 extra. So there's a lot of different base weapons and extra weapons that can be obtained for each character that becomes a part of your party in the game. And so each weapon has its own unique stats in the game itself. And so the way it kind of worked is, kind of worked more like a genuine RPG, where the more you level up your characters, the further their stats increase. Like their magic defense, physical defense, their magic attack power, and their physical attack power, their strength, vitality, and luck, all things that, it's kind of like if you look at a genuine D&D character sheet where you have all your attributes and you have different stat values and all your attributes, and they grow the more you level up. And so Final Fantasy VII definitely worked more like a traditional RPG where all of your stats are automatically increased every time you level up, and the max level in the game is 50 for all characters. So you can't go too high, and it's almost impossible to break the game, like with high-powered magic or weapon damage in this game, because everything is built on a steady system of progression. So you earn certain weapons by playing through each and every one of the chapters. You're only leveling up so much throughout the entirety of the game. It takes at least two playthroughs of this game to level up all the materia and to level up your characters fully and your weapons fully. It takes at least two playthroughs. So they definitely changed that this time around when it came to Final Fantasy VII. So, and I'm very glad that they did that, because then everything genuinely felt like more of a challenge, because you weren't allowed to, over-level yourself and become too powerful for everything, essentially. I will say that the rate at which you obtain more powerful gear in certain items in the game is very steadily paced, and I like that a lot. The way that they designed the materia system in this game, as far as the gear system goes, was very interesting, and I like all the different types of materia and how they attribute different effects in battle, whether it be for physical combat, building your ATB gauges faster, or having powerful magic and powerful healing. It's very interesting, and everything definitely has its use in the game. I will say that it does get a little old pretty quick, having to constantly, like, if you know exactly, like, every single encounter that you're going to go up against in the game, every enemy, every boss, like, if you know what you're going to be going up against, even if you don't know everything you're going up against, you're constantly having to switch up your materia to suit each encounter. And while that's the way the game is designed, and while arranging your materia to be able to make it easier for you to get through each fight encounter and each boss, can be a good thing, because it can make your life extremely easy, or it can make your life extremely difficult when playing through this game, especially if you're playing on hard mode. I will say that having to constantly switch up my materia in-game, whether it be during me recording an episode or off-screen, it still takes up... switching up materia probably takes up half the time it takes to actually play through this game. If I'm being honest, I'd say that, constantly changing materia on all of your characters takes up about half of your time, at least, playing through this game. Even if you're playing through it the second time, it takes up at least half your time. And that being said, I don't know. I don't know any other way that they could have designed it, because that's kind of how the game works. That's kind of how Final Fantasy VII itself works. That's the way it's kind of always been designed, I guess. I don't know if that was the case for the original game or not, but for this remake, that's the way they designed it. And so there's nothing that can really be done about it at this point, and I can't imagine the game functioning any other way, because that's what you have. That's the kind of gear that you have access to, because that's the aesthetic. That's the norm in Final Fantasy VII, is that people use different materia for different things. because it's concentrated Mako energy, and each orb of materia has a different function based on the type of alteration in Mako that it's made out of, essentially. And so while it is intriguing, that aesthetic, essentially, that element to the game, it gets really just time-consuming and annoying to have to constantly switch up my materia. But at the same time, I have to do it in order to kind of make my life easier in certain scenarios, especially for boss fights. In the grand scheme of things, it's a minor annoyance because the things that the materia allows you to do is very significant and can greatly help or hinder your ability in combat. All that being said, the next topic I want to move on to as far as my review of Final Fantasy VII, and this is kind of a big one. And I mentioned it earlier very briefly, but I want to talk about the Arbiters of Fate, or rather the Watchers of Fate, the Spectres, that kind of permeate and weave their way through a majority of the storyline of Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I'll link a video in the description that also kind of better explains the Watchers of Fate's role in the game, especially when it comes to finer plot points toward more of the end of the game. I kind of created my own theory that these specters were kind of tied to the planet, like they were the spirits of they were the spirits of people who had died and passed on and returned to the spirit of the planet itself. And while I personally still think that kind of holds true, because to me that makes a lot of sense, because they act very much like ghosts. They behave somewhat human-like, especially when you hear like screams and moans and wails from these specters. To me, they kind of seem like the spirits of the dead who have passed on, and because Shinra is doing what they're doing, mining Mako for energy, it's causing great disruption and great disturbance in the planet. Therefore, it's stirring up all of these spirits of the dead. And Sephiroth also kind of has an effect on the planet itself and an effect on these spirits. He also seems to be bending these specters, these spirits, kind of to his will in a way. He's defying the natural order of things, because that's kind of what Sephiroth does. I'm still unclear as to Sephiroth's full purpose in Final Fantasy VII and his full backstory. I only know so much at this point. And like I said, I'll provide a link in the description to a video that explains some of the finer plot points, especially pertaining to these specters, these Watchers of Fate, as it were. In that video, I'll kind of briefly explain what was talked about in the video that I'm going to link in the description. Basically, these specters, these Watchers of Fate, their purpose in the game, since this is a remake and a reimagining of the original Final Fantasy VII, the story writers for the game put these Watchers of Fate in the game as a kind of a meta way of controlling the core plot of the game to make sure that certain moments, certain character interactions, and certain plot points in the game stayed more or less on course with the original story of the original Final Fantasy game. Because there really is a lot of potential for a lot of minor and major story elements of the remake of this game to go in a completely different direction than the original story. The story writers for Final Fantasy VII really, and the director of Final Fantasy VII, really, they use these Watchers of Fate as a way to keep a lot of the core story elements from changing too much from the original game. So they're kind of like I said before in like some of the final episodes of my Let's Play, I'm like, these ghosts, these whispers are very whatever you want to call them Watchers of Fate, call them ghosts, whispers, specters, whatever you want to call them, but They have various names. I'm gonna call them specters because that's the first name I saw on them when I fought them towards the beginning of the game. They're a very convenient plot device for making sure that the core plot moments of Final Fantasy VII Remake don't stray too far from the original story. Aside from some minor plot points, some things that happen in the game, especially toward the very end of the game, the final 2 chapters mainly, is when things really start to deviate from what happened in the original story. Given this chunk of plot, the very beginning, from start to when they first fight Sephiroth and start out on their quest to hunt down and defeat Sephiroth toward the end of the game. The ending of this game was very, very different from the ending of the original. And these specters, these whispers definitely have a major role to play when it comes to the end of the game. So basically, whenever there was a moment in the plot that threatened, like whenever there was like a small or a major plot moment that happened in the game that threatened to change the course of the larger story, of the larger timeline, these specters, these whispers intervened either subtly or very directly and aggressively to ensure that the core plot elements did not stray from they're kind of controlling fate and destiny. Like everything is supposedly preordained in this game as far as like the larger story. And these whispers intervene if anything threatens to throw the original timeline of the story out of balance. If anything threatens to... you get what I'm saying, essentially. So for moments like when Cloud was supposed to join Tifa and Barrett on the second mission for the second Mako reactor bombing, after the first Mako reactor bombing, Tifa was having second thoughts as to whether or not they should continue their plan of action, destroying the Mako reactors and trying to take down Shinra and undermine their ability to mine Mako for energy. Tifa was having second thoughts, and Jessie was then originally supposed to join Avalanche on their second mission to bomb the next Mako reactor, and Avalanche and Barrett especially were kind of shutting Cloud out, not saying that they no longer needed his services. And so originally Cloud was supposed to join Tifa and Barrett for the bombing of the second Mako reactor, because at the end of the Airbuster fight, he's supposed to fall from the platform and crash through the roof of Aerith's church into her flower bed, therefore, meeting Aerith and the plot continuing forward from there. Like, that's supposed to happen, that's preordained. And if anything threatens to change that, therefore drastically alter the course of the future, that's when these specters intervene. So the specters launch an all-out attack on the Sector 7 slums in 7th Heaven, injuring Jessie's ankle in the process, therefore leaving a spot for the Mako reactor bombing team open, and therefore they need Cloud. So it's like anytime anything threatens to change the course of a pivotal plot moment, the specters intervene to make sure that everything stays on the right course. So I'll kind of skip over some of the other ones and really kind of explain the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Originally, the ending of the original Final Fantasy VII game, they realize that Sephiroth has to be stopped, and they are ready to go on their quest to hunt down and stop Sephiroth from carrying out his plans against the planet. because he wants to reclaim the planet for himself, and that means a lot of chaos and carnage and destruction. And so there wasn't a whole lot of direction for the team to go on at the end of the original game. And so what kind of ends up happening at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake is after the team defeats the Motorball boss, there's a moment when Sephiroth appears. He seemingly appeared in the 17th chapter at the top of Shinra Tower. I'm kind of bouncing between different plot points. I'm trying to keep my thoughts as organized as I can here, but sometimes it's difficult. There was a point in chapter 17 where Sephiroth seemed to appear when Barrett was confronting President Shinra, telling him to go public and clear their names and explain the truth. And President Shinra gives his whole speech on, really, it's not so much about that, it's about this. Your plan and your motives, your morals are meaningless. Blah blah blah. And there is a moment when seemingly Sephiroth then appears behind President Shinra and stabs him through the chest with his sword. And strangely, there's like a bunch of like black specter-like smoke appearing out of the stab wound. And what happened in that chapter was very confusing to me at first, because first it appears that Sephiroth stabs President Shinra and kills him, which he actually does. But then Sephiroth also appears to stab Barrett, killing him. And then Sephiroth just flat out disappears after that. And then the Genova Dreamweaver experiment, the source of all of Shinra's experiments and monsters, appears, and then that boss battle ensues. But then after the boss battle, Cloud sees Sephiroth ascending outside, and he's carrying one of Shinra's genetic experiments. There's these throughout in the I believe the third chapter, and also in I think chapter 7 or 8, there are these genetic experiments. These people who are human or were once human that were experiments of Shinra. And they're kind of peppered throughout the storyline. They're very debilitated, very weak, just kind of stumbling around, trying to barely survive. And they're wearing these big black cloaks, and they keep their hoods up over their heads and faces. And each of them have a number tattooed on their arms or their shoulders. And all of these are failed experiments. And sometimes, and I didn't really catch on to this until I had watched the video that I'm going to link in the description, there were times when Sephiroth would appear to embody these failed genetic experiments. And I didn't really catch on to it, again, until I had watched the video that I'm going to link in the description. But it turns out that these failed experiments with tattoos on their shoulders, these numbered tattoos on their shoulders, were failed attempts at cloning Sephiroth, because Sephiroth is Shinra's most decorated soldier and war hero. I believe he shares some ancestry with either the Cetra or I believe some beings that crashed into the planet on the meteor that supposedly wiped out the Cetra. And he belongs, I think, to maybe the alien race that potentially wiped out a majority of Aerith's race. Something along those lines. But these failed genetic experiments were failed attempts at cloning Sephiroth. And obviously Shinra wants to have, that kind of, warrior, that kind of power, back on their side, because the real Sephiroth has gone off and rebelled and done his own thing at this point, and so he's rebelling against Shinra, and he's rebelling against the planet. What ended up kind of really happening in Chapter 17 is that one of the failed Sephiroth clones ended up going rogue. he ended up kind of embodying the form of Sephiroth, and he ended up stabbing President Shinra, killing him, and he also ended up killing Barret as well. What ended up happening is at the end of the Genova Dreamweaver boss fight, the reason why one of those specters morphed out of Barret is because Barret was dead, but because that would have disrupted, because Barret dying at that point in time would have disrupted future events too greatly, the Watchers intervened and revived Barret. President Shinra, I guess, was supposed to die, which wouldn't have mattered anyway because he has a son, an heir that can inherit the throne, essentially. So one of the Sephiroth clones ended up going rogue, killing President Shinra and Barret. The Watchers of Fate intervened, reviving Barret. And what ended up happening is that the real Sephiroth, after that boss fight, ended up reappearing, taking his failed clone, carrying him up to the very top of the spire in Shinra Tower, and jumped off, essentially killing the clone, but Sephiroth surviving. And so then at the very end of the game, instead of where Avalanche would have walked off out of Midgar in their pursuit of Sephiroth, trying to hunt him down and defeat him, Sephiroth appears at the end of the bridge in an attempt to fight them right then and there. And because this again would further disrupt future events too greatly, all of the Watchers of Fate then billow up and swirl around Shinra Tower and end up going to spread out and cover the entirety of Midgar in a dome, protecting the city, and also subsequently trapping Avalanche inside, so that way, and Sephiroth inside, so that way nobody can escape. Because what's happening right now is potentially causing too much of a disruption in the original timeline. So Sephiroth slashes open a portal to an alternate reality, an alternate Midgar, and an alternate world, but still on the same planet in the same city, and escapes through it. And at this point, Aerith essentially says that if we don't intervene now and take action, there could be further cataclysm beyond what Sephiroth could possibly wreak havoc on, or the future outcome if we do nothing from this point forward, or if we let him do what he's wanting to do. The devastation could be too great, and so now we have to intervene and essentially change fate for ourselves. So Avalanche walks through the portal, and because they are now attempting to alter fate by altering fate and altering the original timeline at this point by trying to stop Sephiroth from, altering the original timeline and altering the future as well, the Whisper Harbinger and the extensions of itself, Whisper, Croceo, Verity, and Rubrum, intervene in an attempt to stop Barret, Tifa, Aerith, and Cloud from altering the course of events even further. And the Whisper Harbinger and its minions, the extensions of itself, are brought from a future timeline. They're brought from a future timeline that the past and the events of the past gave shape to, or that the future gave shape to based on past events. So there's the Whisper Harbinger is this mammoth being that the future has given shape and form to based on past events, and it's a being pulled from a different timeline in the future in an attempt to preserve the original timeline and the original story and plot of Final Fantasy VII from being altered too greatly. This is its last and ultimate attempt to prevent stuff like that from happening. And the extensions of itself Whisper, Crocio, Viridian, Rubrum are essentially future alternate versions, Whisper versions of Cloud, Tifa, and Barret. And I didn't, again, this is another connection that I didn't make at all when I was playing it, but then the closer I looked at their weapons of these Whisper extensions, Rubrum uses a sword like Cloud. I think Crocio uses like energy cannons, almost like guns like Barret, and then Viridi uses its fists like Tifa. So these are essentially future Whisper versions of Tifa, Cloud, and Barret, the three core members of Avalanche, that they're having to fight against themselves in order to change the course of fate and the timeline that is now ensuing, that Sephiroth is trying to disrupt, essentially. And so they have to defeat the Whispers of themselves and the Whisper Harbinger that's essentially getting in their way in order to get to Sephiroth and fight him to prevent him from doing what he's doing. Because either way, Sephiroth is attempting to alter the course of history and the future too greatly. And either way, whether he succeeds or loses at this point in time is irrelevant, because he still ends up surviving by the end of the fight, ultimately taking Cloud to the edge of creation, trying in one last attempt to get Cloud to join him to alter fate, essentially, and defy destiny, to kind of pursue their own course, and Cloud refuses. While all of this is going on, Zack, Cloud's friend and mentor from the soldier program, is outside the city. He's outside of Midgar in a past timeline. So if you're thinking of this in a linear fashion, the events of Crisis Core set up the events of Final Fantasy VII. And originally, Zack is supposed to have died holding off Shinra forces. And Zack dying is the catalyst for Cloud essentially rebelling against Shinra, and it's why he ends up joining Avalanche, even as a mercenary at first, to disrupt their Mako reactors and take them down. But now, because Sephiroth is attempting to alter events of the original timeline, what ends up happening is, with all of the Watchers of Fate creating a protective dome around Midgar, it's creating ripple effects in the original timeline, and so now Zack can see all of the Watchers of Fate in a dome around Midgar in his own past timeline. Like the effects that the specters are having on the original timeline is now reaching back to the past in Zack's time, and he can now see, that Midgar is concealed in a dome of specters, essentially, because Sephiroth is attempting to alter the original timeline, and because the Watchers of Fate are having to intervene, the effect that they're now having on the original timeline is beginning to show. And so, after the team defeats Sephiroth, and after it's showed that he survives and escapes, he gives Cloud a choice to join him or not. Cloud refuses at the edge of creation, and Sephiroth says 7 seconds to save, essentially to save the world or save this reality. It's like, not time enough for you perhaps, but what will you do with it? And so essentially what happens after that is it kind of cuts to a scene where Zack has defeated all the Shinra forces that were attempting to ambush and kill him. He survives, and then there's a blast wave of energy, and he gets knocked to the ground, and Midgar, somewhat of a more seemingly downsized version of Midgar, blasts itself into, I guess, the past, blasts itself into Zack's timeline where he's still alive, where he originally would have died holding off Shinra forces, but instead he survives. And instead of any more Shinra forces ambushing him and attempting to kill him, Midgar, from the alternate reality that it was warped into, is now blasted back into the past where Zack is. And the best way I can describe it is that they essentially time traveled the city and everyone in it, including the members of Avalanche, time traveled back into the past from the alternate reality / current timeline that they were in. And then from there, the city is essentially saved. It's essentially, I think, still in the same spot it was, if not slightly relocated, so to speak. So then everyone, the city is saved. Everyone in the city is still pretty much alive. Somehow, because of the altered course of events, at the end, when Midgar is transported to Zack's timeline in the past, Biggs ends up surviving, and Marlene ends up kind of hearing, the spirit cry of her father outside the city. Barrett saying he'll be back soon as he can. And so this is the point in the game where originally the team decides to take up their mission to track down and defeat Sephiroth once and for all. But now that the course of events have officially been altered and they're essentially now in the past / an alternate timeline going forward, some things are slightly different. Biggs has survived, and now technically at this point in time, where Zack would have originally died, giving the catalyst for Cloud to leave Shinra, leave the soldier program, and join Avalanche, Zack is technically now still alive, or at least in an alternate timeline. I'm not sure. It's still very open-ended, and we don't have all of the answers, and we're not going to have all the answers until more installments of Final Fantasy VII Remake come out. Personally, what I choose to believe is now that, without realizing it, I don't know if now, the time loop of Zack dying, giving Cloud reason to leave Shinra and the soldier program still exists now. If it's kind of a paracausal or paradoxical time loop that's since kind of collapsed on itself and then been changed. What makes most sense to me to try and explain this is that, again, Midgar being trapped in the alternate reality that Sephiroth tore a hole into has now been transported into the past, where Zack has now survived the Shinra onslaught and is kind of carrying Cloud to safety. And they kind of show Zack with Cloud over his shoulder, brushing shoulders with the current timeline Cloud and current timeline Aerith. And Zack was the guy that Aerith was originally talking about being her first true love, essentially. So Aerith knew Zack, and when she tried to reveal that she knew Zack originally to Cloud, Cloud had another mental lapse, essentially, because I guess Cloud's mental lapses can kind of be explained in a way like his original memory of things. It seems like he has amnesia, and the more his memory comes back to him from the original timeline and the original story of Final Fantasy VII, the more it contradicts with what's actually happening now in essentially this new timeline. And so he constantly has these mental lapses throughout the game where Sephiroth is kind of directly interfering and changing things from the original story, changing things from the original plot and timeline, and it's causing these mental lapses within Cloud. because it's not the way he remembers things, and it's causing a paradox essentially within his own mind and his own memories. So it's a lot. It's a lot of detail and a lot of. I've already been talking for almost an hour here. It's a lot of plot, a lot of detail, and a lot of stuff to try and explain. So far, I've explained it the best that I feel I can, because it can be very confusing to get into. The plot of Avengers Endgame was more simple to explain than this. So, I feel like I've kind of explained everything that I feel I can accurately explain to the best of my ability. If anyone is still kind of unsure about certain plot points and details of the Final Fantasy VII Remake story, after having watched my review of this game, like I said, I'll provide a link in the description to a video that kind of better explains in depth, in a shorter video, kind of the overall plot and how these Watchers of Fate play their role in Final Fantasy VII Remake. But overall, in just under an hour's time, those are my thoughts and plot analysis and opinions on Final Fantasy VII Remake. At some point in the future, I may try to play the original just to see how it compares. Personally, I feel like I kind of figured out all I need to figure out, all I can figure out at this point in time. So I can't wait for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 to come out so we can further experience the reimagining of this story going forward now from essentially this altered timeline from the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake going forward with Part 2. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, to see what changes are made. That is my initial review of Final Fantasy VII Remake and the plot analysis, without going into too much detail of the entire plot. I loved the game from start to finish. It is definitely one of those games that just, it takes a hold of you from the very beginning and it doesn't let go, even if you've never played the original. I absolutely loved it and I highly recommend it. So until next time, until the next video, my name is ImTheDude5 and this is ImTheDude Games. So please be sure to subscribe to my channel if you like my content. Click the bell icon for notifications so you don't miss any content like this video, as well as any others of mine you enjoy. And be sure to follow me on Twitter. I'll provide that link in the description as always, so you can stay up to date on any and all channel news. Thank you so much for watching. It's been one hell of a ride doing this Let's Play. As always, stay classy. I will see you all out there in the next video.